Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa sallallahu wa sallam wa baraka nabi Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So welcome to the Monday meeting and the continuation of our commentary on Kitab at-Tawheed. And we have reached chapter number 18. And that is the chapter which the Imam entitled Babu Qawlihi Ta'ala Innaka la tahdi man ahbabt. Chapter, the statement of Allah, certainly you cannot guide whomever you like. And so in this chapter, the Imam, he mentions the verse from Surah Al-Qasas, the 28th chapter, verse number 56, in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ يَهْدِي مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَهُوَ أَعْلَمُ بِالْمُهْتَدِينَ. Verily you, O Muhammad, cannot guide whom you like or whom you love. But Allah guides whom He wills, and He knows best those who are guided. And he also mentions, in addition to that, the hadith like Bukhari and Muslim, on the authority of Sa'id ibn Musayyib, on the authority of his father, Al-Musayyib. And in that hadith, he said, لما حضرت أبا طالب الوفاة جاءه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وعنده عبد الله بن أمية وأبو جهل فقال له يا عم قل لا إله إلا الله كلمة أحاج لك بها عند الله. فقال له أترغب عن ملة عبد المطلب؟ فأعاد عليه النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فكان آخر ما قال هو على ملة عبد المطلب وأبى أن يقول لا إله إلا الله. فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا أستغفرن لك ما لم أنه عنك. فأنزل الله عز وجل ما كان للنبي والذين آمنوا أن يستغفروا للمشركين ولو كانوا أولي القربى وأنزل الله في أبي طالب إنك لا تهدي من أحببت ولكن الله يهدي من يشاء وهو أعلم بالمهتدين. And so in this hadith, which we see from the tail end of it, we see that the verse he cited, this hadith actually explains the reason or the circumstances that led to its revelation. That what happened that prompted the revelation of this verse, you cannot, O Muhammad, guide whomever you love. So it says that when death approached Abu Talib, Allah's Messenger ﷺ came to him and he found Abdullah ibn Abi Umayyah and Abu Jahl in his company. Why do you guys think that the Prophet came when he heard that Abu Talib was on his deathbed? Ahsant. So one of the reasons is because of the great relationship that they had between them and the great love that the Prophet had for his uncle Abu Talib. Was that the only reason you think he went? Ahsant. That basically he was hoping that somehow, some way, after all of his efforts for almost 13 years of prophethood, that he would be able to convince him before his last breath to become a Muslim. That was his hope. When he got there, though, there were two people standing in his way. Right? These were very close relatives of Abu Talib and relatives of the Prophet, Abdullah ibn Abi Umayyah and Abu Jahl. So they were already there. Why do you think they were there?
So he doesn't get convinced?
Yeah, to do the opposite. They were there to make sure he remained firm upon the religion of their forefathers, the religion of as-Shirk, right? طيب. So the Prophet said, O uncle, say there is no true God except Allah, a word which will enable me to plead for you with Him. So if you just say La ilaha illallah, that'll give me the ability to argue on your behalf. Right? I'll have a case. That'll give me a case with Allah on your behalf. So the two of them said, Abu Jahl and Abdullah ibn Abi Umayyah, they said, are you going to forsake the religion of your father or your forefathers, your father specifically Abdul Muttalib, meaning the religion of as-Shirk? So the Prophet repeated his request. Come on, be a Muslim. Accept Islam. Say La ilaha illallah and I'll be able to argue on your behalf. But they also did what? They repeated exactly what they said. Are you going to leave the religion of Abdul Muttalib? They repeated the exact same thing. And all they did, they just kept repeating the same thing. You're going to leave the religion of your forefathers? You're going to leave the religion of Abdul Muttalib? They just kept repeating the same thing. They didn't say something different. to prove or to convince him. They felt that that was sufficient. And it turned out to be sufficient. So the final word of Abu Talib was about being on the religion of Abdul Muttalib. Before he took his last breath, he said, Huwa ala millati Abdul Muttalib. He is upon the religion of Abdul Muttalib. I'm dying upon that faith. And he refused to say La ilaha illallah. The Prophet ﷺ said, I shall continue to pray for your forgiveness as long as I am not prohibited from doing so. I'm going to do the best I can with what I have. But it was then that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed the verse from Surah at-Tawbah, the 9th chapter, verse number 113. It was then that Allah revealed, it is not proper for the Prophet and those who believe to ask Allah's forgiveness for the mushrikeen, even though they be of kin. And he also revealed the verse, which is the title of this chapter, Verily you, O Muhammad, guide not whom you like, but Allah guides whom He wills, and He knows best those who are the guided ones. So, you see the chapter is pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's an ayah and a hadith. And if you notice, if you remember, the Imam spent 3 chapters responding to 2 of the strongest arguments that the pagans give to justify their idolatry. The first one is the people that we worship, they have the independent power to help us or to protect us from harm. And even if we say that they don't, they at least can what? Make a shafa'ah. They can at least intercede. And so we do these acts of devotion to them, where it's animal sacrifices or prayers or supplications or oaths, whatever we offer to them, we offer to them because we believe that at the very least, in exchange for these acts of devotion, they will make shafa'ah for us. They will intercede for us. So the Imam brought those 2 chapters to do what? To show they don't have independent power. And even though there's something called a shafa'ah, they don't own the shafa'ah. They can only give a shafa'ah if Allah permits it, and for those He's pleased with. See that? Then he follows that with this chapter to further emphasize what he already mentioned in the previous chapter and to drive the point home. And that is that the righteous and saintly people are not independently righteous. They're not righteous because they themselves have made themselves righteous, but rather their righteousness is a gift from Allah and a favor from Allah. Also, they don't possess, despite their righteousness and their virtue, they don't possess the independent power to guide or otherwise help anyone besides themselves. You guys see that? They don't possess the independent power to guide or help or prevent harm from anyone else. They can't guide whoever they choose or protect whoever they choose or help whoever they choose. But rather they can only what? Guide, protect, help who Allah wills. You guys see that? And that's part of the meaning, or a major part of the meaning of what Allah says when He says, or what the Imam is getting across when he says, or he quotes Allah saying, You, O Muhammad, Imam as-Salihin, the leader of the righteous, the most virtuous human being, the greatest of Allah's creation. You can't guide whoever you will. You don't possess that independent power to do that. And if that's true for the Prophet Muhammad, it's even more true for what? Those lesser than him in rank, right? So it's like the perfect complement to what he's already said. Look, the Prophet couldn't even guide his own uncle. And we're going to see why that's really significant, that he couldn't guide his own uncle. We're going to see why that's really significant as we go through it. So the Imam, basically, to make this point, he cites this verse from Surah Al-Qasas, the 28th chapter, verse number 56, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. You can't guide, you, O Muhammad, can guide whomever you like or those who you love. And he mentions, as we said, the hadith, it shows the circumstances, the context in which that verse was revealed. And so that's the basic meaning of the chapter. We could actually close the book up and leave right now. That's actually the basic meaning of the chapter, but there's so much benefit in the verse and in the hadith. We're going to kind of go through it with a fine-tooth comb and bring out some of the what? The beneficial points from the ayah and the hadith. So let's look back at the ayah. So he says, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. Certainly you cannot guide whomever you love, O Muhammad Allah is speaking to the Prophet Muhammad and telling him, you can't guide whomever you love. There's two possible meanings that the scholars have mentioned, and both of the meanings are intended, although one of them is primarily intended. So the first possible meaning is إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ هِدَايَتَهُ. He said, you can't guide, O Muhammad, just because you want to guide. Guidance is not in your hands. It is in the hands of who? Allah. You can want it, O Muhammad. Muhammad wants somebody. I want desperately for this person to be guided. I want them to, their heart to change. I want their heart to open and embrace Islam. I love for that to happen. But Allah is telling him, all of the love in the world cannot make that happen unless Allah what? Wills, because He's the one who ultimately does what? Who turns the hearts and opens the hearts and causes them to embrace what? Embrace Islam. That's the first meaning, right? That guidance is not in your hands. Opening the chest, making the heart accept truth is not in your hands, O Muhammad. It's in the hands of who? Allah. Even if you want it, it's not going to happen unless Allah wills. That's the first meaning. The second meaning, which is the primary meaning intended because of the context of the verse, but both the meanings are true. The ayah reflects or indicates both meanings, is that you, O Muhammad, can't guide the person you love. Allah guides whom He wills, not whomever you like. And this is the main reason why the Imam cited this verse, because he wants to show people who hang their hopes on individuals because of their righteousness, that if I can get in this person's good graces, he'll intercede for me, he'll protect me, he'll bless me, he'll give me good things, I'll be blessed by virtue of his righteousness. Allah is saying, even if the righteous person is pleased with you, that doesn't mean that he can what? He can guide you, he can help you, or he can protect you. Because the righteous people can't protect people just because they what? They love them or they like them. And in this way, Allah is showing the Prophet is what? He's powerless. He is powerless. Who has the real power? Allah. You guys see that? And you're going to see, and this is the thing about the Quran. It's very consistent. It might say things in different ways, but the message is what? Is the same. All the power is with Allah. So who should people's hearts be attached to? Where should people turn? Allah. You guys see that? طيب. So now, if we study the Quran, this ayah and other ayat where Allah mentions al-hidayah, we're going to see that al-hidayah, guidance, is of two types. The first type of guidance is the hidayat al-dilala wal-irshad, the guidance of showing. The guidance of showing the way and pointing in the right direction. The second type of guidance that the Quran talks about is hidayat al-tawfiq wal-ilham, which is influencing the heart and allowing it to embrace truth and faith, opening it up to that and allowing it to what? To follow it. You guys see that? So the first one, which is hidayat ad-dilala wal irshad, the guidance of showing. Anybody can do it, right? You can do it. I can do it. I'm doing it right now, right? Anybody can tell somebody, this is the way, right? This is the path. So when we tell our children, tell the truth, don't lie. What is that?
Guidance.
That's guidance. You're guiding them. That's hidayat al-dilala wal irshad. You're showing them the way, right? You're showing them the path. You tell them God is one. That's hidayat al-dilala wal irshad. You're showing them the way. You're guiding them. And anybody can do that. And this is what Allah means in the Quran when He says to the Prophet ﷺ, وَإِنَّكَ لَتَهْدِي إِلَى صِرَاطٍ مُسْتَقِيمٍ. Oh, you, O Muhammad, you guide unto a straight path. You guide unto a straight path. You are guiding them. You're showing them what? The right way. And this is what the Prophet meant when he said in the hadith of Sahl bin Sa'd al-Sa'di, collected by Bukhari Muslim, he said, لَأَنْ يَهْدِيَ اللَّهُ بِكَ رَجُلًا وَاحِدًا خَيْرٌ لَكَ مِنْ حُمُرٍ النَّعَمِ. If Allah were to guide through you one person, it would be better for you than the best form of wealth, the best thing you can think of, the best thing you can imagine, right? So in these two, this verse and this hadith, the guidance as mentioned is what? The guidance of showing, right? The guidance of showing. طيب. But the second one, which is hidayat al-irshad, the guidance of what? Opening the heart. That guidance is the guidance that only Allah can do. Bil ijma'. Only Allah can do that. And that's the guidance Allah is talking about when He told the Prophet, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. You can't guide those whom you love. You can't what? You can't make their heart open up and embrace the truth. طيب. Now, you notice, He said, you, O Muhammad, you can't guide the one you love. And we know from the hadith of Al-Musayyib that he was talking about Abu Talib. That he's admitting, Allah is acknowledging that the Prophet loved his uncle Abu Talib. But Abu Talib was a disbeliever, right? He was a disbeliever. So that means that the Prophet loved his uncle who was a disbeliever. Now, how do we understand that in light of the fact that Allah has told us repeatedly in the Quran, we're not supposed to love the disbelievers. We're actually supposed to despise them because of their disbelief, right? Even if they're what? Family members. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تتخذوا عدوي وعدوكم أولياء تلقون إليهم بالمودة. He says, oh, you who believe, do not take my enemies and your enemies. Calls them enemies. Don't take them as what? Your allies, your intimate friends, people you love. And he goes on to say, تلقون إليهم بالمودة. You what? You offer them your affection. You offer them your love. وَقَدْ كَفَرُوا بِمَا جَاءَكُمْ مِنَ الْحَقِّ. While they have disbelieved in what has come to you of truth. Allah is telling us we have to hate them because they disbelieve. Our love for Allah has to make us angry at the people who don't what? Who disbelieve in Him, who insult Him, who say He has a son. You guys see that? We also have the ayah where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا لا تتخذوا اليهود والنصارى أولياء بعضكم أولياء بعض ومن يتولهم منكم فإنه منهم إن الله لا يهدي القوم الظالمين. He says, oh, you who believe, do not take the Jews and Christians as allies, as intimate friends, as people you love, besides the believers, right? They are just friends and allies and loved ones to each other. And whoever gives them their allegiance, whoever gives them their love, فَإِنَّهُ مِنْهُمْ. Then he what? He's one of them. He's one of them. إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يَهْدِي الْقَوْمَ الظَّالِمِينَ. Allah will not guide the people who are what? ظالمين, right? They are wrongdoers. We also have the verse where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, لا تجد قوما يؤمنون بالله واليوم الآخر يوادون من حاد الله ورسوله ولو كانوا آباءهم أو أبناءهم أو إخوانهم أو عشيرتهم أولئك كتب في قلوبهم الإيمان. Right? Allah says, you will not find the people who believe in Allah on the last day loving those who oppose Allah and His Messenger, even if they were their fathers or their sons or their brothers or their kindred. And the people who are like this, who withhold their love from the non-Muslims, from the non-believers, Allah has inscribed faith in their hearts. Allah is saying that faith and this disavowal of the non-Muslims is what? They go hand in hand. You guys see that? So we see this, and we see that people in our time, a lot of them are not like this. They don't follow this. They don't adhere to this. Wa alaikum salam. They're very negligent and they're very liberal. Just want to digress really quickly. They're very negligent and liberal in this regard. And in many cases, they prioritize their own interests. A lot of people, they have very close relationships with non-Muslims. And I'm not talking about being friendly. There's a difference between being friendly and being a friend, right? Being loving and loving someone. You guys see that? You have a neighbor and you're neighborly. You're friendly. You're loving towards them. But you don't what? You don't love them. They're not your friends. You guys see that? You don't take them as friends. It's a difference. But some people, they do. They take them as friends and they give them their intimate love and they take them as allies. And sometimes it's because why? And sometimes it's because they themselves are maybe doing something that makes them feel guilty. And when they associate with the Muslims and take those Muslims as intimate friends and they're in their close proximity, when they want to hang out with someone, they hang out with Muslims. When they want to invite someone over to the house, they invite a Muslim. Well, if they're doing these things, for example, if they're taking interest, they're smoking cigarettes, right? If they're maybe watching things that they shouldn't watch, and they do that in front of these Muslims, what are the Muslims going to say? Hey, you shouldn't be doing that. They're going to advise them because that's what a brother does for a brother and a sister does for a sister. They're going to advise them, right? And Muslims have certain what? Certain expectations. They have certain expectations, but when you're with non-Muslims, they're what? The expectations are what? Lower or non-existent? Non-existent, right? They're not going to disapprove if you do these things. They're not going to discourage you. They're not going to. And some people like that. They like the fact that this non-Muslim may even encourage me, right? I show him, for example, the offer from the bank for the loan, right? With, 8% interest. It's like, man, given the housing market and everything that's going on, that's pretty good, brother. You should go for that. Whereas a Muslim's going to say, man, you can't do this, haram, right? That's war with Allah. You guys see that? Well, I don't want him to tell me that because then I can't buy the home. And so I want to be in a situation where the expectations are what? Lower. So it's an interest thing. It's in my interest to associate with what? With the non-Muslims and to take them as what? Intimate companions. I won't be held accountable. I won't be called out. When I do the wrong things, I won't be called out. They might even what? Encourage me. Some people, they do it. It's an emotional thing. I really like so-and-so. So-and-so has a great personality. Yes, those things can be true. But when our religion says something is wrong, we don't let our emotions take precedence over what our religion says. See what I'm saying? Let's say a person who converted from disbelief to Islam. And their favorite food when they converted was pulled pork sandwiches. Right? I love pulled pork. Right? It's my favorite thing. I might eat a pulled pork sandwich every day. So his emotion in his heart is attached to what? But once he becomes Muslim, can he continue to? Because his heart is attached to that? No, he has to abandon because what? He has to put what he believes is right over what his heart caused him to incline to. You guys see that? And sometimes it's a personal perspective thing. People put their personal perspectives. Like, I don't know, to me, I should be able to be friends with whoever I want to. I've got this. I know how to establish boundaries. And people will say that. I've had conversations with people and they'll say, hey, man, I've been knowing this person, all my life. We've been friends since we were, little kids on the block. And I think we can still be friends and my faith won't be impacted. Again, it's a personal perspective now. It's an opinion. It's putting your opinion before the deen of Allah. Allah doesn't tell us avoid things except because those things are bad for us, right? And sometimes we don't understand how they're bad for us, but we have to trust who? Allah, who knows everything. Tayyib. So coming back to the point. So we have Allah saying, admitting or acknowledging that the Prophet loves Abu Talib. At the same time telling us we can't love the disbelievers. How do we reconcile? The scholars of Islam have reconciled it like Ibn Hajar in Al-Fath and Ibn Kathir in his tafsir, and other scholars have reconciled and said there's two types of love. There is the religious or spiritual love, the love of faith and the love dictated by faith. And there is the innate or intrinsic love, al-mahabba tabi'iyya, which is dictated by what? It's natural, it's intrinsic, right? And so he said that basically the love that Allah is talking about as it relates to the Prophet and Abu Talib is the natural love. That you love people who are related to you. You love people who have done good for you. And we're going to see that Abu Talib did a lot of good things for the Prophet ﷺ and supported him. You love the people who love you, right? And show you affection. You love them what? Naturally. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that love is okay. But at the same time, the spiritual love, the love dictated by Islam, that love has to be what? Has to be withdrawn from them. They can't have that type of love. And that's the love that Allah is saying we can have in all those ayat that we mentioned, and even some of the hadith of the Prophet, which we did not mention. So a person says, okay, well, make this make sense to me. How can you love something and hate it at the same time? Right? You have to hate the disbelievers, the religious hatred. But you can love them, the natural love, right? To make it simple, and then we could actually have a whole separate talk on this, right? But to make it simple, because we're going to get through a few points and then leave time for discussion, the likeness of it, as some of the scholars have given the example, is a likeness of a person who takes a distasteful medicine. Back in the 80s, there used to be an ad for Buckley's cough syrup. And the ad said, it tastes awful, but it works. It tastes awful, but it works. Like we're letting you know up front, It's disgusting. It's going to be hard to get down, but it works, right? So basically, this Buckley's, for example, this distasteful medicine, it works. So you hate it from one angle and you love it from the other angle. You hate it from the angle of what? The taste. But you love it from the angle of what? Its effectiveness, right? Nothing opens me up like what? Like Buckley's. Nothing quiets my cough like Buckley's. And I like that. I like Buckley's. I'm going to keep buying it. Why do you buy it? It's disgusting. Yeah, you're right. It's awful. And I hate that. I hate the taste, but I love what? The effectiveness. You guys see that? You guys see that? Same thing. We love our loved ones who, some of them might be non-Muslims. We love them because of the connection of being kin, the relationship. And we hate them because of what? They disbelieve in Allah. And our hearts, primarily, are supposed to submit to Allah. And how do we submit? Part of that is loving what Allah loves and hating what Allah hates. Allah loves belief and He loves the believers. He hates disbelief and He hates the disbelievers. So how can we not hate them? The religious hatred. You guys see that? طيب. ثم بعد ذلك, the hadith, there's a few points we'll take out of the hadith really quickly. So the hadith itself, if you look at it with the backdrop of the Prophet's seerah, the early part of his life in general, and the early part of his prophethood in specific, it reveals the curious case of Abu Talib. Abu Talib is an enigma. He's a strange character in the life of the Prophet ﷺ. How is that? So Abu Talib, he never, as we see in the hadith, he never proclaimed the testimony. He never accepted or embraced the Prophet's religion. And he remained committed to the pagan religion of his forefathers. We see that clearly from the hadith of Al-Musayyib. But at the same time, he made statements and he did things which indicate that what? That he believed. Particularly, he believed that the Prophet was telling the truth and he was indeed a messenger of Allah who received revelation from on high. So for example, there's a series of abiyat, there's some shi'r, qasida, where Abu Talib praises the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. And in one of those lines of poetry, he said, وَدَعُوتَنِي وَعَلِمْتُ أَنَّكَ صَادِقٌ وَلَقَدْ صَدَقْتَ وَكُنْتَ ثَمَّ أَمِينًا. He said, you invited me to Islam and I knew you were truthful. I knew you weren't lying. When you said you received revelation, when you said you were a prophet, when you said that if I followed you, I would be saved, I knew that you hadn't told a word of untruth. I knew you were telling the truth. You weren't lying. You weren't a madman. Then he said, you told the truth and you were in addition most trustworthy. I could put my hand in your hand and follow you wherever you went and I knew I would be safe. SubhanAllah. Right? What does that tell you about where his head was as it relates to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ? Right? And so it's almost like he's saying, I believe Muhammad Rasulullah. But then if you look at the hadith of Musayyib, it's like he's saying, I disbelieve in La ilaha illallah. Is that going to benefit you? If you only believe in half of the shahada? Subhanallah. So he doesn't fully believe in the Prophet's religion, but at the same time, if you look at the seerah, you see how he stood by the Prophet ﷺ. And his support for the Prophet was unyielding. So for example, when the Prophet, when his mother passed away, his care went to the hands of his grandfather, Abdul Muttalib. But it was only a few short months after that he passed away. So he was still very small, very little boy, and his care went to Abu Talib. Abu Talib he fostered him and became a father figure for him. And he was very, very protective and very, very loving towards him, even more so than his own kids. And it mentions in the seerah that he had this special place, a special like chair or majlis that he would sit on in the shade of the Kaaba. And nobody could sit there except him. And if somebody came to sit there, his other children would push them off and say, nobody can sit here except our dad. And they themselves wouldn't sit on it. And they would just stand around it Even if nobody was sitting there, they would stand around it. They just didn't feel like it was proper or appropriate for them to sit there. But the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, he used to always come and sit on it. And if they came to try to shoo him away like they did for the others, Abu Talib would say, leave him, let him sit there. He can sit there. So he treated him with like a special love and care that he didn't even give to his own kids. Very protective. He was very protective. He would never let the Prophet ﷺ out of his sight, right? Unless he was in the care of someone he trusted. He would never let the Prophet out of his sight, to the point that he was going to travel to Syria, and the Prophet was about 12 years old. And he took the Prophet with him, which wasn't normal. It wasn't normal for a small child of that age to go on a business trip. Basically, they went for business. They would leave the kids at home with the women folk. But he took the Prophet. Why? Because I want to look after him. When the Prophet ﷺ became the Prophet and he started preaching Islam, at the same time, he's criticizing the idols and the idol worship of the pagans. And that was basically the religion of Abu Talib. He's basically, in a roundabout way, he's criticizing Abu Talib and criticizing his religion. But he still what? He still supported him. Like you're criticizing me, you're criticizing my religion, that's fine. I still have your back. So now Quraysh wants to rise up against him. They want to harm him. And so Abu Talib does what? He stands between them and the Prophet and tells them, if you want to hurt him, if you want to move one hair on his head, you have to come through me. Nobody wants to mess with him, right? Nobody wants to mess with Abu Talib. Nobody wants to disrespect him. Nobody wants to fight him. And so they would stand down. And they told him in many occasions, they would come to him and say, look, just step out of the way and let your nephew become fair game. We just want to get him out of the way. We don't want any trouble with you. And he would always refuse. And he would even tell the Prophet Muhammad, go ahead and say whatever you want. Curse their idols, do whatever you want, and I've got your back. He would tell the Prophet ﷺ. So when the conflict got to a fever pitch, all of these different clans of Quraysh, the sub-clans, they said, you know what? We're going to boycott them. We're going to boycott Bani Hashim. We're going to force them to give up the Prophet ﷺ. Now, I want you to think about that. Boycott means if they go to the market, no one will sell them anything. Boycott means if they have a young man who wants to get married and he wants to get married to one of the other clans from Quraysh, they'll refuse his proposal. Boycott means if there's a girl that you want to marry to one of their young men, they'll refuse your proposal. Boycott means they won't do business with you. Boycott means if you say, hey, I have some goods, will you take them to Syria? They won't take them for you. Which means that there's no livelihood, there's no way we can eat, there's no way we can function, and we're constantly feeling that we're under what? Under the threat of some violent harm coming to one of us or coming to the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. So they felt mutarreen, they felt forced to go to Shi'bi Abi Talib, go into the valley of Abi Talib so they could kind of like protect themselves, basically. And they were there for 3 years under this very, brutal embargo, to the point that there were babies that were hungry and their cries for hunger could be heard, right? They were like far out of the city and they could be heard in the city. But they what? They did that at the command of Abi Talib, who did that to support the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. I mean, you just see how far Abu Talib was willing to go. But despite all of this that he did for the Prophet ﷺ, the Prophet couldn't benefit him. Right? You guys see that? And this is the point that the Imam is trying to make by complementing the previous chapters with this chapter. Look at all that Abu Talib did. Look at the love between them. And the Prophet couldn't do what? Couldn't even just guide him. Couldn't even guide him, let alone save him. Now, that doesn't mean the Prophet couldn't do anything for him, because we have the hadith where Al-Abbas, he said to the Prophet, Ma aghnayta an ammik. What did you do for your uncle? فَإِنَّهُ كَانَ يَحُوتُكَ وَيَغْضَبُ لَكَ. Because he used to protect you and he would become angry for your sake. So certainly you had to do something for him, right? So the Prophet wanted to assure his uncle, Al-Abbas, who was the brother of Abu Talib. So he said, هو في ضحضاح من نار ولولا أنا لكان في الدرك الأسفل من النار. He said, yeah, I did what I could. he is in a small pool of fire. And in one narration, it says that it what? That pool of fire that is just up to maybe like his ankle area makes his what? His brain boil. And if it were not for me, he would have been in the lowest depths of the fire. So he kind of did benefit him, but not to the extent that a person would what? Would like or expect. And this is who? Abu Talib, who did things for the Prophet which most believers can't claim. Some of the believers in the time of the Prophet can't claim they did for the Prophet what Abu Talib did. But ma dhalik, the Prophet couldn't what? Couldn't benefit him beyond what? Beyond lowering the punishment, lessening the punishment. And this is an exception. Remember we talked about how there's no shafa'ah for the people of a shirk. There's no shafa'ah unless Allah is pleased and he gives permission. You guys see that? The one exception is what? Abu Talib. And even then, all the Prophet could do was what? Lessen the punishment, couldn't totally what? Relieve the punishment. If this is the case for the Prophet, how much more so is it the case for what? For those lesser in rank. طيب, what else can we say really quickly? طيب, just really quickly, a few points so we can have some time for discussion. If you notice in the hadith, when the Prophet came to try to encourage his uncle to be Muslim, there were two people there, Abdullah ibn Abi Umayyah and Abu Jahl. And they were there to what? To kind of like counter whatever the Prophet said. And they did just that. Oh, he's going to say la ilaha illallah. We're going to say, follow the religion of your forefathers. Follow the religion of your forefathers. And what did he ultimately do? He followed the religion of his forefathers. What does that teach you? It teaches you the danger of having the wrong people in your circle, keeping the wrong company, That basically these people who were bad actors, they were bad influences, they influenced him to die upon a shirk. Shows you the danger. And it also shows you that this is just as true for adults as it is for what? For children. A lot of times we tell our kids, hey, don't hang around with this. He's not a good person for you to hang around. But in many cases, we're hanging around what? The wrong people. And we talked about earlier about making non-Muslims our close companions. Not saying you can't be friendly with them, can't be a good coworker, can't be a good classmate, can't be neighborly, but to take them as your intimate what? Intimate friends and allow them to be the type of people who what? Who influence the decisions you make. Influences the decisions you make. We can't do that. Also, it also teaches you what? They just kept saying your forefathers, your forefathers, your forefathers. This shows you how convincing this argument can be. When people keep saying, this is what your parents did, this is what your parents did, this is what your parents did. What that does to many people is they say, man, how can I change what I'm doing? How can I change and follow a religion or follow a way or follow an understanding or follow a practice different from my forefathers? If I do that, it's almost like I'm saying they're wrong, they're bad people, they didn't know what they were doing, they were ignorant, they were misguided. I don't want to say that about my forefathers, so I'm going to do what? I'm going to stick to my guns, although I can clearly see that the truth lies elsewhere. You guys see that? That's what happened to him. Did he see that the truth was elsewhere? He said, I know you're telling the truth. I know I can put my hand in your hand and trust that you're going to take me on the right path. I know this for certain. But I don't want to say that my forefathers were wrong. This is a very dangerous argument, and it is one of the main things that keeps people upon falsehood even after truth has become clear to them. And we've seen it on different levels. We've seen people, for example, those of us who converted from other religions, we've gone to our loved ones, we've talked to them about Islam, and they're just the whole time, they're nodding their head. It makes perfect sense. One God, strict moral code, you don't drink, you don't smoke, you don't do drugs, that just makes perfect sense. You're good to your parents, right? You believe in raising your children, you believe in family. They're just nodding their head the whole time. He said, okay, well, is there anything about this, any fault you can find in this religion? Absolutely not. So don't you want to become Muslim? My forefathers. This is all I know. I don't want to. We have to avoid this tendency even as Muslims. How many times do you go to somebody who follows a particular madhab? And in their country, everybody does it like this. You tell them, yeah, but that's not the sunnah. That's not what the Prophet said. That's bid'ah. No, not even bid'ah. That's kufr. That's disbelief. And they'll say what? This is what the people in my country do. This is how we do it. And I don't want to be saying that they're wrong. And that if we do that, what's the difference between us and those people to whom the Prophet was sent, trying to save them from shirk? And they said, "Inna wajadna aba'ana ala ummatin wa inna lahum wa inna ala atharihim muhtadun." That we found our forefathers following a path, and we're going to follow right behind them. What's the difference between us and them if we do that? We have to be the people who, what we follow is the truth, the evidence from credible sources. If this is what Allah says, and this is what it means, we're going to follow that. And that doesn't mean that that we're disrespecting the people who took a different path or follow a different way. Maybe this knowledge didn't come to them. We're responsible for the knowledge that came to us. And that doesn't mean that we're blaming them, but we have to avoid that tendency because it's a very dangerous tendency. طيب, let me see what else. So last but not least, I just mentioned Al-Ujala, is that when the Prophet said, he said at the end, and Abu Talib, he passed away after saying that he was upon the path of Abdul Muttalib, or the religion of Abdul Muttalib. The Prophet said, I'm going to continue to seek Allah's forgiveness for you until I'm prohibited from doing so. And Allah revealed, right? It's not for the believers to seek forgiveness for the non-believers once they know that they've died upon falsehood. And he also revealed, إِنَّكَ لَا تَهْدِي مَنْ أَحْبَبْتَ. So one of the things that we learn from this hadith is that it's not permissible for Muslims to ask forgiveness for the non-Muslims, particularly after what? After they've died upon disbelief, right? It's not permissible to do that. And even during their lifetime, the only exception would be to ask for Allah to forgive them with the intention of saying, oh Allah, guide them. Oh Allah, guide them to Islam, and then after that, forgive them. You see that? You see what I'm saying? That would be the only exception. So we don't pray for their guidance. It's not permissible, and the proof is the verse we mentioned from Surah At-Tawbah, and the fact that the Prophet was prohibited from making dua or seeking forgiveness for Abu Talib, despite the fact that he did all that he did for him. And just to sum everything up, before we open for any questions or discussion, to sum everything up, the purpose of this chapter was to complement the previous two chapters and to show and to highlight the fact that the righteous people are not righteous independently. Their righteousness is a favor and a gift from God. And that righteousness does not endow them with certain independent powers to help people, help whomever they choose, or to guide whomever they choose. But rather, they're only able to help those who Allah wills and protect from harm those who Allah wills. So and this is the case for the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and if it's the case for him, it's the case for those who are lesser than him in rank. And so since these righteous and virtuous people can't help anyone or harm anyone except by Allah's will, our hearts should not be attached to them. Our hearts should be attached to who? Allah. Because al-khayr kulluhu biyadi. Because all the good is in his what? In his hands. And so it's wrong for us to ask the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ for anything or ask any saintly person for anything, but we ask who? Allah. We shouldn't worship or offer acts of worship to these saintly persons, thinking that they can somehow intercede for us, or they can guide us, or they can help us in any way, but rather we should offer acts of worship to Allah, because if we worship Allah and we are upon Tawheed, then we will be entitled to everything that we're seeking from what? From other than Him. Whereas if we seek it from others, we won't be entitled to what? To any of that. So that's basically the meaning of the chapter. Any questions, any comments, any critiques? تفضل أبو خديجة.
When we make a dua to disbelievers, we usually say, may Allah guide you. But sometimes if you say, I'm sick, can we say, may Allah give you shifa?
Can you pray for their shifa? Let me get back to you. I'm not 100% sure. I know for certain you can't pray for their guidance. The question is, can you pray for other things for them? Things less than guidance? And I'm kind of vaguely recollecting some statements of the scholars on that. So let me revisit it because I want to make sure that we say the right thing the first time. So I'll come with an answer next time. Inshallah ta'ala. Taib, any other questions?
You just said that the pray for the believer, that Allah give them guidance and open their heart to become Muslim, right?
You can pray to Allah to guide the non-Muslims. Yes.
And you added something on the end of that.
So basically, if a person were to say, what we can't do is we can't pray for the forgiveness of non-Muslims. That's clear from the verse, right? That's clear from the verse. So what will be the exception? The exception would be to say, Allahumma gfir lahu, or Allahumma gfir lahum. Oh Allah, forgive him, or forgive her, or forgive them. And what a person intends by that is, oh Allah, guide them to Islam. And once they accept Islam, forgive them. Because what's the natural, or what's the default if you accept Islam? That your previous sins will be forgiven. So what we're saying is that a person could say those words, but their intention, the only exception was that their intention would have to be that, oh Allah, guide them. And when you guide them, you're gonna forgive them. Yeah. Barakallahu feek. طيب. تفضل وعليكم السلام ورحمة الله.
So from last week, and I think this week too, the highlights about asking somebody to make dua.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just reaffirm for me the idea of, like, you know, if somebody, you know, that you have high hopes in him, right? Like the sheikh, or he's, you know, hafiz or something. From the outside, you feel like he is, you know, have taqwa, right? So you would ask him, can you make dua for me? Right? I can't remember exactly how did we end up the conversation last time, but I feel like you settled on, like, it's okay, but it's not really preferable to do it. So in the time of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Sahabi, I can't get his name right now, but I know there was a Sahabi that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said that he is accepted dua.
MashaAllah, yeah.
You know? The Sahaba in the time of the war, they went to him and they asked him to make, like, they stood in front of the castle for multiple days and they couldn't open, and then how would you wait while you have the Sahabi in between and go and ask him to make dua for you? And he refused in the beginning, and then he raised his hand and he asked, Ya Allah, open for us, and then he asked for him to, you know, soul to. So this is asking somebody, right, that knowing the fact that Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam said about him, you know, that he is mustajab al-da'wah. Umar ibn Khattab radiallahu anhu used to go to the kids and knowing that they don't have khataya or dhunub and ask him, make dua for Umar. Right? So you on the outside knowing that somebody could be accepted of dua and asking him, why would that be not, you know, preferable? Like, why wouldn't you do it?
Mumtaz. All right. Like, so
with the fact that I just want to, I know his dua is in Allah's hand still to be accepted or not, but just, you know, it's a way to, and I'm sure doesn't have any hand in anything, you know, he can make it happen or not, you know, it's just, at the end of the day, it's in Allah's hand, but it's just like, you know, the hope that he has taqwa and Allah will, his mustajab dua, maybe his dua will be accepted. And it also would not stop me from making dua for myself or from others, you know. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Like, no worries. So, few things here. So, one, a lot of what you said reaffirms the fact that you can ask someone to make dua for you, and that's not something that we deny. There's too much evidence to deny that. Okay, so we don't deny that. We don't question that. You can ask someone to make dua for you. The second thing that you mentioned, or one of the things you mentioned, was there was a companion who the Prophet ﷺ mentioned and described him as being mustajab ad-da'wat. And there were instances where he made dua for people and it was accepted, just like the Prophet said, to the point that it became a fitna, right? And he had to actually, like, basically run away because so many people were turning to him to make dua. But the difference between him and some of the other people that we might turn to for dua is that the Prophet specifically mentioned that he had this fadl. And we don't have any evidence other than, like you said, their outward appearance and what we see from their deeds to indicate that they are even pious, let alone, because piety is one thing, and mustajab ad-da'wat, that your supplication is always answered, is something else. You could be pious and virtuous. That doesn't mean that your dua is going to always be answered. So this person had this fadl and the Prophet mentioned it. And so we know that he had it because the Prophet said he did. So we can't make an analogy between him and others. That's one. And then you mentioned the case that Umar al-Khattab used to go to kids. Why?
Because they have no sin.
Yeah. So he went to them because of what? A fadl that he knew that they had. And he asked them. See that? The Prophet ﷺ, he asked Umar when he was about to leave, he said, "La tansana min salih du'aik." Don't forget us in your righteous prayers. Because Umar was going for Umrah. He was traveling, right? The dua of the traveler is accepted. He was going to do this ibadah. So it's expected. You're going to be in this holy place, doing this holy thing. Your du'as won't likely be accepted. So you notice there were qara'in. There were
other people with Umar in that Umrah though. Why didn't he go to anybody else?
Who? What do you mean?
Rasul sallallahu alaihi
No,
wasallam.
he was leaving and he was seeing him off. And so he said that. So it wasn't like the Prophet went around asking different people to make dua for him. There were circumstances, there were factors that made it worthwhile in saying that. And the Prophet has an obligation also too, through his practice and behavior, to show us, to model acceptable behavior, to let us know basically this is something acceptable. We need to know that. So there's no argument that you can do it. The argument that we have is it preferable? Right? Is it preferable? And you said, well, why do we say it's not preferable if you know? First of all, if we're talking about, again, a sheikh, an imam, a person you think is muttaqi, we don't know if his dua is going to be really accepted. We don't even know his reality, because a person can appear in one way to us and be totally different, right? And we have, for example, the statement of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, أَخْوَفُ مَا أَخَافُ عَلَيْكُمْ الْأَئِمَّ الْمُضِلِّينَ. He said, the thing that I fear for the most for you, the thing I fear the most for you is those imams who will be really what? They'll be people who misguide you, right? So there'll be people like that who will wear the cloak of scholarship, wear the cloak of piety, and in reality they're wolves in sheep's clothing, okay? So the fact that we see them in a certain way doesn't mean that we know for certain, okay? That's different from the examples that you gave, that's one. Number two is, even if we know this person, we just, we've spent enough time with him and see that he is, what you see is what you get, right? He is as advertised. We could ask him, but that wouldn't be preferred for us to ask him. Why do I say that? There's a difference between allowed and preferred. And I'm going to give an example just to close the loop. But there's a difference between allowed and preferred. Something can be allowed, but not the ideal scenario. And how do we know this? Because the ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِذَا سَأَلَكَ عِبَادِي أَنِّي فَإِنِّي قَرِيبٌ. And if my servants ask you about me, I am indeed near to them. The scholars of Islam said the implication of that is Allah wants us what? To ask him and not to have an intermediary between us and him. The other danger, okay? The other danger that is presented, and one of the things about Islam is that whenever there's a con in doing something, right? That con is supposed to impact whether or not we do it or not. So one of the cons is that a person may get in the habit of asking others and may not do what? May not ask himself. Whether that is your case or not, that con is something to make you what? To make you avoid that, except what? In extreme cases, or so if a person does that every now and again, there's no harm. Why? Because it's allowed. But to make that your habit, where you're asking other people, which a lot of people do. A lot of people will always ask other people to make dua for them, and many of those people are not making dua themselves. Now I come back to close the loop and say preferred versus permitted. So for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he says in the Quran, he says, فَمَنْ اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ فَاعْتَدُوا عَلَيْهِ بِمِثْلِ مَا اعْتَدَى عَلَيْكُمْ. He says, whoever transgresses against you, you can what? Respond in kind. Somebody slaps you, you don't give him the other cheek. In our religion, you're allowed to what? To hit back. Allah tells us in the Quran, somebody slaps you, you're allowed to slap them back. Right? But he also says, وَلَا تَسْتَوِي الْحَسَنَةُ وَلَا السَّيِّئَةُ ادْفَعْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ فَإِذَا الَّذِي بَيْنَكَ وَبَيْنَهُ عَدَاوَةٌ كَأَنَّهُ وَلِيٌّ حَمِيمٌ. He says, good and evil can never be equal. So repel evil with that which is better than it, meaning good. Respond to cruelty with kindness. And you will find that the one who had previously been your most bitter enemy becomes your nearest and dearest friend. When you put the two verses together, what is Allah telling you? Somebody hits you, you can hit him back. That's permitted. But what's preferred? That you don't do that. So you want to ask somebody to make dua, you can ask them. That's not the preferred thing. It's permitted, but it's not preferred. Does it?
I see the part when you're saying about, when somebody, hit you and it's better off.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's ayah about it, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing that I can reference to be, I know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says,
Hey.
He didn't say qul or anything. He said that
Yeah.
you yourself make the dua. And I'm not subjecting that I'm not gonna stop making dua, but I'm saying like if somebody is traveling going to Hajj, and I know he's a pious person, I'll just go and call him up. I usually will call him up. Hey, make dua for me when I go to Hajj. For me at that point, it is preferable. I want
Preferable or permissible?
I think it's both. Because the Rasul sallallahu
Allahumma salli ala Muhammad.
Somebody's traveling to Hajj, like of Omar, that he is biased. So why would I follow the steps of Muhammad? Well, Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam didn't say no. If Omar is traveling, you can make dua for him, but you don't ask him to make dua. So there's no like a thing of elaborate hadith or ayat of the Quran to stop me from doing it.
No, we didn't say that you can't do it.
Tell me.
We didn't say you can't do it. See, there's a difference, and we have to be very daqiq. We have to be very nuanced. We didn't say you can't do it. We didn't say you couldn't do it. We have all the evidence in the world to say that you can. But there's a difference between something being permitted and preferable.
Preferable comparing to what? To making your own dua?
Making your own dua, yeah.
Sure, I'm with you. Making
That's
your
it.
own dua is
That's what we're saying.
Right.
That's all we're saying.
Okay.
We're not saying you're about to make that call and you say, "Oh, don't make the call." We're not saying that. We're not saying that. We're not saying that at all. We're saying that asking someone to make dua for you is permitted. It's permitted. The evidence is there. But it's not preferred. And why is it not preferred? Because it's always better to ask yourself and for there not to be intermediary between you and Allah. That's the preferred way to do it. It's just like a person can make a ghusl by just what? By just saying Bismillah, doing al-madmada wal-istinshaq, and doing what? And taking a shower. You can make ghusl like that. That's it. You have to make wudu and the ghusl, but that's permissible. But it's not what? It's not preferred. What's preferred? Preferred is that you say Bismillah, you what? You clean your private parts, and then you do what? You make a complete wudu with the exception of your feet, and then you do what? You take a shower starting with what? With your right side, then you do your left side. That's what's preferred. But the first one is permissible. But they're not equal. They're not equal because Allah is indicating to us that He wants us what? To come to Him without any intermediaries. And again, sometimes something in of itself is fine. But because it can lead to other things, our religion is very keen to do what? Yasud al-bab. Close the door. Person can start asking other people to make dua, or ask a specific person because he seems so pious. And we talked about the effect it can have on that person. Right? We also talked about the effect it can have on the person who asks him. If I ask you, and what I ask you to ask for me, it happens. Then I ask you again, it happens. That can be a fitna for me. You see that?
Sure.
So nasud al-bab, and we make dua. But there are going to be occasions, situations, like you said, somebody's going for Hajj. I meet him, this is the last Jummah before they leave. And I say, La tansani min salih du'aik. The Prophet said it. There's nothing wrong with it. Permissible, but not necessarily preferred. Especially, even more so not preferred if we make it what? We make it a habit. Yeah, and Allah, I'm telling you, Allah wants to hear from us. He wants us to beg Him and to ask Him to believe He'll answer us. He wants us to do that. And it doesn't have to be the most eloquent dua. We don't have to be the most pious person. We just have to what? Be sincere. And sometimes our sincerity might cause the dua to have a greater effect and bring about better results than the person who's what? Who we think is so pious. We just have to really have that in our heart. Allah wants us, وَقَالَ رَبُّكُمْ أُدْعُونِي أَسْتَجِبْ لَكُمْ. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بارك الله.